Good morning, all 15 of you in the room. Woo! Yeah, I'm in the big hall with 15 people. Anyway, I'm glad you all are here. I'm going to bring up a number of things in this session that I think are important that I'll just share with you all. How many of you have heard about artificial intelligence at any point in the last 4 hours? Perfect. I'm going to bring up some stuff about it that I'll just say to you all are missing from the narratives. They're missing in two capacities. They're missing based on who's talking about it, as well as their lived experiences in relation to it. Because I'm a big believer in, I'm a proponent of it, but I'm also, well, you'll see. I bring up a lot of stuff. So one, this image is going to be kind of like, it's a plant. So if you understand how movies work, the concept is called Chekhov's gun, which is you see a scene where two people are speaking at a table and there's a gun on the table and their dialogue has nothing to do with that gun. That's going to show up in the story later. So this is going to show up in the story later. But the main idea around this session is that we really have to start rethinking our approach to not just learning and education, but how we are going to incorporate artificial intelligence in it. And I say that in the sense that, well, one of my top 5 oxymorons is education and innovation. Because even Darren just brought it up in his talk. If you think about how often innovation is used as what I always say is a fancy word or within the context of jazzy jargon, but yet I would ask you all to think in terms of how much have our learning environments actually changed from when we were in school. So I say that because we have to start rethinking a lot of stuff, and I'll share with you all a little bit about this, and that is the whole idea about rethinking is not a remix, and I will emphasize this in the context of artificial intelligence. It's also not disruption. What it requires is us to actually dismantle a lot of things. We need to tear many things down in order to begin the process of when you dismantle it, you can reimagine what it looks like. Then based upon that, you can redesign it, which will lead to a transformation. And that's how we have to think about artificial intelligence. The remix is the idea around, well, here's AI, and I'm going to give you 10 prompts that you could use if you're a math teacher. Here's 10 prompts for a science teacher. That's just a remix. Because what it's doing is taking an emerging technology and remixing what we're already doing rather than transforming it. So I'm going to go through some of that. But I also think it's important to recognize how fast artificial intelligence has come out since November of 2022. Think about how many things have changed already. In addition to that, the way artificial intelligence exists at this moment right now is the absolute worst version that will ever exist. And so that's why it's important for me to share with you all this quote by Dr. Joy Buolamwini. AI should move slow and fix things. Anyone want to guess what the opposite of this quote is? That is a very famous quote by a certain individual who runs a certain large social media company. Move fast and break things. If you all don't know that, that was Mark Zuckerberg. And I think that was not only a grossly irresponsible quote, it was obtuse. Because think about it. Move fast and break things is easy for me to say that when I don't have to face the consequences of those broken things. When I can shield myself from that. This is the way it should be. We should move slow and AI should fix things. So I'm going to present to you all a couple of scenarios. I'm going to give you a moment to pause. I'm going to ask you to select one of them. So here's scenario 1. You are looking for support on how to get from one point to another. You would like for me to show you one route and only tell you about all the cool and amazing things that you will see. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2, you are looking for support on how to get from one point to another. You would like for me to show you all the possible options so that you can choose. You also want me to show you which routes have barriers, dangers, and lead to dead ends. But you also want me to tell you about the cool stuff that you will see. There's your 2 scenarios. Darren's in the room. Darren, you would be proud of me with this. How many of you select scenario 1? Scenario 2? I love it. Good. I've been asking this question for at least the last 6 months, and early on, the percentage of hands for scenario 1 was almost 100, and I'm watching how that's now shifting. It reminds me of a question that actually Darren and Jennifer, who are close friends of mine, inspired me that I always ask is, do you want me to give you the best information or do you want me to give you all of the information? How can we say we value critical thinking and say we want to support students' development of critical thinking if we're not giving all of the information rather than the best information? And so that's why I share this, because unfortunately, many of the ways in which artificial intelligence is being presented in education is scenario 1. It is not scenario 2. I am going to share with you all scenario 2 since you selected that. So these are the things that I will focus on in the time that we have, and I recognize I have 50 minutes, so a lot of it will be somewhat abbreviated, is the importance of digital literacy, the importance of digital fluency, understanding the impact of bias, the development of acute language skills, and the cultivation of a technology acumen. All 5 of those things are critical when it comes to transforming our learning environments in the use of artificial intelligence. And just like I think we should demand of speakers all the time, I try to model, here is how I define those terms in this context. Digital literacy is the ability to use information technology and digital media to find, evaluate, create, and share information effectively, responsibly, and safely. Digital fluency, the ability to choose and use technology comfortably, effectively, and intuitively. In this context, bias, the potential for automated systems like machine learning models or algorithms to produce skewed, prejudiced, and/or unfair results due to problematic data and/or design. And then lastly, our acumen, one's depth of understanding and ability to appropriately leverage technology to achieve educational goals. I'm going to cover all of that in this session. So starting off, I want to do a little level setting. This is how Collins Dictionary defines artificial intelligence. A type of computer technology concerned with making machines work in an intelligent way similar to the way the human mind works. Okay, that's a basic definition of artificial intelligence. By the way, artificial intelligence has been around since the mid-50s. It is not something new. And I'm going to age myself, so I know some of you in this room, when we fill out a survey, we'll check off the same age demographic range box. My first entry point or first experience with artificial intelligence was when I was writing papers in college using Microsoft Word, and I made a mistake leaving out a comma, and Clippy would pop up. So if you're shaking your head, yes, we're the same age or within that same range. But if you'll notice, it's the whole idea, make them work in an intelligent way. But here's the catch. Who's defining intelligent and based on what perspective? And I will get into that with some questions later. The next one is that it uses these advanced algorithms and machine learning and deep learning to analyze data, identify patterns, and make predictions. So we're going to do a quick social experiment. Y'all ready? Y'all ain't ready. Y'all ready? All right. So this is a blank. I'm going to ask you all to fill in the blank. Once upon a, thank you. You just identified and predicted what was going to fill in that blank. However, I could also say midnight dreary. But the reason why I mention that in this context is there's a higher likelihood based on your historical knowledge, i.e. the data sets in your brain, that Ken will fill in that blank with time, not midnight dreary, because that's what happens most frequently. I'm going to do another one. I'm going to ask you all to fill in a blank. So I'm going to give you some context of a story. So I was hanging out with a very close friend of mine not too long ago, and he owns a boat. And so we got on his boat, and we took the boat out probably about 2 hours off the coast. And as we were out there in the water, it was a calm, sunny day. And as we were out there on the water, I was setting up my gear, my reel, my rod, and my hook. And I was getting ready to bait my hook, and I looked over the side of the boat, and I saw a school of. Thank you. That is exactly how the large language models work. It goes based on the predictability of patterns. It does not generate new content. it can't generate new content. It goes based on historical patterns, and the more we use it, it identifies additional patterns. I want to do another experiment with you all. Please take out your phone. What I want you to do, and unfortunately we don't have enough time for me to go with a microphone with you all, is I want you to create a new text message, but not to anybody. And watch this. Just tap the predictor, the middle. You see how it automatically popped up some text? Just start tapping on it. See and look at what kind of a sentence it makes. What you just did is exactly how the large language models work. That is exactly how it works, and you're doing it with a limited data set that is essentially part of the programming on your phone. Now, we don't have enough time to do it. See, Sue's laughing. We don't have enough time to do it, but the funny thing is I like to go around and ask people, what did it have it say? You see that? That's predictability. That's how it's predictive in what we do. So now I want to do the next thing. We're going to do another social experiment. So that's the predictability of patterns. You all just did it in 3 different ways. Now we're going to do the next thing, and I'll explain what it is. If you can, go sit near somebody, move into proximity of somebody near you. Reasonably near you. You don't have to be right next to them. And we're going to take 1 minute. We're going to do 30 seconds with the first person. Then I want you to swap roles for 30 seconds. And here you go. The person sitting next to you is a chatbot. I want you to ask them something simple like, what's for lunch or what did they have for breakfast? And then after they answer, I want you to modify it and ask them, based on what you ate, make it healthier. 30 seconds for one, then we'll switch the roles, 30 seconds the other, go. Okay, switch roles, please. And time. What you all just did is exactly how the chatbots work. The technical language is natural language processing. That's exactly what you just did. The whole point of these first 2 sets of social experiments is that this is not a technology. It's like, oh my God, it's really complex and I'm not sure how it works and I need to just, what I always say is you don't want to delve into the whole idea around automating and microwaving your learning because there's some facade of how complex it is. It really isn't. It's not designed that way. So I'm going to go through a few other things and we have more social experiments, so if you all don't mind, definitely stay where you are seated. So the whole idea is that AI is here, it's not going away, and while I reject people that say they can predict the future, here's something that I can say we can safely predict about the future. How do we know that AI is not going away and it's going to continue to grow and expand? Follow the money. There's your answer. Follow the money. Now, just like all these other things, I want you all, the next slide, I want you all to think about how many of these things impacted your personal and your professional life. And I'm going to add another question. How many of these things were, once they became available to the masses, were well received and universally embraced? My favorite story to share is that icon in the middle on the left. Because yes, I was that student in class, math class especially, where I'd ask the teacher, can I use a calculator? Teacher would tell me no. But that teacher would also tell me that she's preparing me for my future. Okay. So she would tell me no. And they would always follow up with, you can't use a calculator because what? Are you going to have a calculator with you all times when you get older? Actually, yeah. So that's the whole idea around when you start to see the response to an emerging technology that becomes available to the masses, the whole idea being, more often than not, it is not met with embracing and implementing. It is often met with fear-mongering and resisting. And so I share that with you all because if you think in terms of artificial intelligence, big question to ask, is AI overhyped? And I'm getting some of you shaking your head no, some of you are kind of like, eh. Well, I'm going to play a video for you all. And yes, I did grow up with a TV like this.
But you know, I think about this, and what about this internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
What the hell is that exactly?
Well, it's become a place where people are publishing information.
Right.
So everybody can have their own homepage, companies are there, the latest information. It's wild what's going on. You can send electronic mail to people. It is the big new thing.
Yeah, but you know, it's easy to criticize something you don't fully understand, which is my position here.
Go ahead.
But I can remember a couple of months ago, there was like a big breakthrough announcement that on the internet or on some computer deal, they were going to broadcast a baseball game. You could listen to a baseball game on your computer. And I just thought to myself, does radio ring a bell? You know what I mean? It's just...
There's a difference.
There is a difference.
It's not a huge difference.
What is the difference?
But you can listen to the baseball game whenever you want.
All right.
Too.
Oh, I see. So it's stored in one of your memory deals,
Exactly.
and then you can come
That's
back
the
a year
RAM
later.
thing you talked about earlier.
Yeah. Do tape recorders ring a bell? Yeah, I just don't know. What can you, just knowing me, the little you know me now, what am I missing here? What do I need?
Well, if you want to learn about the latest cigars or auto racing
Right.
Statistics.
Well, you know, I've got that covered. I subscribe to 2 British magazines devoted entirely to motorsports, and I call the Quaker State Speed Line about 2 times a half hour. So now, would the computer give me more than I'm getting that way?
Oh, you can find other people who have the same unusual interests you do, and
You mean the troubled loner chat room on the internet?
absolutely.
I think one day I'll get one of these deals, but I've played with them, and then you type it in, and then you get that thing, that little arrow. Is that the arrow you move?
Bet.
And then
you
it's
bet.
just, it's like, oh, I get it. It's an.
All right, so for those of you that aren't within my age range, the gentleman on the left is David Letterman, who used to host a late night show, and the gentleman on the right is Bill Gates. David Letterman asked Bill Gates a simple question: what is this internet thing? Did he answer his question? And most of you, I'm looking at like either no or kind of like, eh. No, he didn't answer his question. He told him things you can do with the internet, but he didn't answer what it actually is. And that's the problem, is that if we can't simplistically explain the technology, then it is unrealistic for us to expect others to be able to even understand what you can do with it. He asked him, what is this internet thing? I can explain the internet in less than 10 seconds. A network that allows one computer to talk to another. That's the internet, the internet. Intercommunication. One computer talks to another. We can get into more technical aspects around the fact that it is not only one computer talking to another, but your browser converts sounds into pictures and text. For those of us that grew up during dial-up, that was the computers talking to each other. But that's what it does. He didn't explain what it is. And his answer could be very different now. Yeah, you could go on and listen to a radio or a baseball game on the internet. Now, for me, it would be like you can listen to any baseball game, anytime, from anywhere. Oh, you subscribe to magazines? Now you can aggregate multiple magazines and authors into one interface, no matter where you are, anytime in the world, the minute they click publish. You see, it's different. Those are the things you can do with it. This is how, unfortunately, how artificial intelligence tends to be explained to educators. These are all the things you can do with it, but not what it actually is. You all have already gone through 2 different experiments on what it actually is. Predictive, okay, and able to process your inputs using your own natural language. So that's that, but I want to get into a couple of things to keep in mind, because these are things that are either often dismissed, overlooked, or intentionally ignored. So I'm going to share with you all another quote from Dr. Bulamwini. By the way, she wrote a book called Unmasking AI that I strongly recommend. The design of AI systems is not only a technical issue, but also a social and ethical one. We need to ensure that AI systems are aligned with human values and do not perpetuate or exacerbate existing inequalities and injustices. Okay? Now, let's get into the ethical side first. So these are 3 critical questions I always pose in my AI workshops, and I'll even share with you all a little bit about when I have a conversation on these questions with student focus groups around AI. So the first question to ask ethically is what I'm doing, is it against the law? So my use of AI, if I have AI write a paper for me, is it against the law? Well, obviously that answer is no. But for us in an educational conference, does it violate explicit school or district policy? And I put explicit in italics because I often hear, well, we do have a digital citizenship policy. I'm like, yeah, but that's not explicit. Show me that policy, and I bet you I'll be able to poke holes in it and circumvent what you have in there. And I even bring up the fact that I actually reject the use of digital citizenship policies, because who's defining the citizenship and based on what perspective? So number 1, does it do that? The second one, what if everyone did this, and how would I feel if someone did this to me? And I pose this question to students. We're in class together. You spent hours writing a paper. I went to a large language model, had it write it for me. How you feel about that? And of course, they would use certain terms, which we'll get into those in just a moment, and I would say, right. So I also need to consider the fact that if I'm okay doing it, how would I feel if it was done to me? And then the big one is that third question. Am I sacrificing potential long-term benefits for short-term gains? Sure, I can have it write it for me, but I pose the question. I literally do. This is why you have to include learners in this conversation. I said, you know what? Why don't we do this? I would meet with like the English department or the social department. I said, just give me an assignment that you've already given the students, and they do it. And I say, have one of the large language models write it for you. First, what potential long-term benefits am I losing out on intentionally of my own accord by having that do this for me? Second, I always tell them, now read what it wrote. And then they would read it, and I'll say, now tell me what your thoughts are on that. True story, most of the time, I get the following from the students. I mean, it's okay, but that's not really how I sound. Perfect. So then would you turn that in, since that's not how you sound, that's not how you write? And then, of course, they get into, well, probably not. I would change something. Right. So what I'm hearing is we could actually use it to help you as a thinking partner for some ideas that you have, but not replace you. And then my big question I like posing to students is, how do you feel about someone else speaking for you? And almost universally, they're like, no, I don't like that. I'm like, great. So let's go back to the ethical question. If you don't want someone speaking for you, then that also tells me that you don't want something writing for you either, because that's your voice. And I share that with you all because more often than not, the conversation around the use of artificial intelligence occurs without the inclusion of the student voice and perspective. What is going to be more effective? A policy that is overly restrictive and overly punitive, or guidelines that have been co-designed and co-developed with the learners? Which one is going to be more effective in the long run? So those are questions to ask, and then I even go even further into this. How are ethics defined in your district, school, or classroom? Sadly, I have found many, in fact, I haven't even found one school district or school system that even has an ethics policy. And then if they don't, again, you see my follow-up questions. Do the definitions include student voice? Do they reinforce learning power dynamics around conformity and compliance? That's usually what it is. You can't, do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. And I always say that you're going to get on that hamster wheel of conformity and compliance with the learners, especially if they were like me, where I'm like, oh, I see you have a rule there. I'm going to figure out a way to circumvent that. And true story, that's how I was in high school. Every time I would go into a class, I'll give you all a side note story because I'm doing okay for time. Every time, my junior year in high school, I had friendly wager with many of my classmates that every class that if I shared classes with them, I said, every class we go into, if a teacher has a list of rules on the wall, if it's 10, I bet you by the end of the semester it'll be 20. And someone would take me up on that wager. And so I go into class, and rule number one all the time was what? No talking in class. And this goes to the whole idea around co-constructing with student voice involved. Okay, so rule number one is no talking in class. So the minute the teacher says to me, or says to the class, we're going to have a class discussion, my hand goes up, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. How can we have a class discussion when rule number one says no talking in class? And then my other favorite one was, must remain in your seat at all times. Okay, class, we're going to have to join into groups so we can collaborate. So do I carry my desk with me because it says I must remain in my seat at all times? You all see it. I'm taking those things literally. What was the problem with that? Number one, you didn't co-construct what the ethos of the room is with the student voice involved. And two, all of those rules were strictly around conformity and compliance. They had nothing to do with safety, and they had nothing to do with learning. And that's why it's important to include the student voice in it. I'm also going to expose a couple of other things that require much, much more care and dialogue, but I'm still going to bring them up as well anyway. These two things come up all the time when it comes to artificial intelligence. Oh, if you use a large language model, it's plagiarism. Oh, if you have it do your work for you, you're cheating. Okay? So before I talk about this, here's our next experiment for you to do with your chat bot that's sitting next to you. Ask them to define plagiarism in one sentence, and then the modifier is in a legal context. Take 1 minute, go. Man, my nose. And switch roles, please. And time. How'd y'all do? Anybody feel their response was on point and also with the modifier in a legal context? If your answer is no, don't worry, because I'm going to cheat. There's this thing called Google. We all use it, but I'm saying that because I remember, I've been around ed tech for a while. I remember when it was, don't let the kids use Google because they're going to Google the answers. And my response was always, well, then we should be asking different questions. Okay? So I'm going to cheat and use Google and share with you all. So there is a dictionary called the Black's Law Dictionary, which is the industry standard in the legal profession. And I want you all to see this is exactly how plagiarism is legally. Oh, come on. Why? Now I'm getting the spinning ball? You got to be kidding me. Oh, there it goes. I don't know why it's doing that. Anyway, it's going to enlarge in just a moment. But this is how Black's Law Dictionary legally defines plagiarism. So based on the legal definition, can I plagiarize a large language model artificial intelligence? No, I cannot. So that's why it's a moot argument, and it is, I'll just say that any arguments around using it or around plagiarism either tells me, one, it's a person that doesn't know this, which is fine because you can obviously look it up, and or two, there's something else going on, which I'll touch on shortly. But you all see, you cannot plagiarize the AI, and if you go based on this definition here, technically, the real plagiarists are the large language models because they are taking the work of humans and representing it as its own, technically, okay? So there's your legal definition. Now what I want to get to, we're going to do another one. So remember this? There you go with your chat bot sitting next to you. Ask them to define cheating in one sentence in your modifier and make it understandable to a fifth grader. And swap roles, please. And time. All right. So I want you all to see a couple of things real quick. So number one is if you just do a search, Stanford Research AI chatbots cheating, if that's your syntax, it'll pull this up. And they interviewed two Stanford education scholars on AI chatbots and student cheating. And some of the statistics they brought up were the fact that they had asked a group of students, I think it was 1,000 students, if they had used an AI chatbot to cheat. And I think the number was like 44% said that they had used an AI chatbot to quote unquote cheat, okay? So that's one, I would encourage you all to, again, Google that and read that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And even when it comes to the whole idea around guidance and guidelines via policy, there's an article that was written in Ed Week that schools are taking too long to craft AI policy and why that's a problem. Now, I share these things with you all because I'd be curious to know, which obviously I can't for time's sake, how you define cheating. Because here's how I really feel about this whole thing. More often than not, efficiency and a more condensed usage of time is associated with cheating. I did something quicker. Oh, you must have cheated. True story. This happened to me when I was in school, and it's reminded me of when I taught. I finished work early sometimes in class. Teacher didn't ask, well, what was your workflow? Teacher would accuse me of, oh, you finished sooner than I thought. You must have cheated. And again, this is how I was thinking in school. This is how I think now. I literally challenged my teacher. I said, okay, so if you're going to punish me for finishing early, are you going to reward me more points for taking longer? That was my response. Again, get into the whole concept of cheating. This literally came up with a district I work with. They said, well, if the students use AI to do their writing, then they're cheating. And I said, okay, so are you going to have a policy that says you can't do this, you can't use AI for your work, otherwise you're going to be accused of compromising academic integrity and you're cheating? Yes. All right, I get it. So you remember the quote from Joy Buolamwini, right? Okay, so I get it, fine. Then if you're going to craft a policy on that, then I also want to see the policy that says that you forbid families that have the economic resources from hiring a tutor. I also want to see a policy that you forbid the parents or adult caregivers who are college educated from helping their child that they're responsible for because they have an unfair advantage over those who aren't college educated. Y'all see what happens with that, right? That's the whole idea around this cheating. Like, I need you to define it first, and then be careful how you define it because I can poke holes in that, as opposed to looking at AI as another emerging technology that is a digital resource, and if we craft policy that provides guidance and guidelines on the usage, then you're not going to worry about the cheating aspect. My whole thing, like with that article, I wish I could talk to those Stanford instructors, because my whole thing is the whole idea around education in general is, more often than not, education is both reactive and addresses a symptom. My whole thing is be proactive in addressing the disease. Ask students, what is happening in the context of your learning that you offload your opportunity to learn how to write more effectively onto something else? What was missing that you said, I don't want to do this? Or what really happens with a lot of students, I don't have confidence in myself that I'm capable of doing this, so I'm going to have something else do it for me. Again, disease, not symptom. So that leads me to a couple of other things, and then I want to show you some use cases as well. Y'all probably heard about these whole thing about these plagiarism detectors and AI checkers, right? Let me tell you all, they're all garbage, flawed by design. There's a reason why you're starting to see a significantly higher uptick in families that are suing schools and or school systems for using things like Turnitin. Turnitin is designed to catch you plagiarizing work. But the reason why I say that, because I'll go into the ethical side of it in just a moment. The reason why I say that is twofold. Number one, if you'll notice, these are questions to consider around that. Number one, and this happened recently, a close friend of mine, his brother was in grad school, he turned in a paper, the teacher ran it through, actually the teacher didn't run it through Turnitin, the teacher used ChatGPT to check if his paper was written by AI, and the professor has no idea, literally on the OpenAI website, it tells you, do not use this to check for AI. And so I said, before we get into the technical aspect, I said, you need to ask your brother, produce a piece of paper that shows that I acknowledge that I am consenting for you taking my original work and putting it into a program that you can't explain and you can't guarantee that my intellectual property and my data is protected. Therein lies why a lot of families are suing school systems and universities that use Turnitin. Because number one, they're using it without the knowledge and or the consent of the individual. So that's an ethical thing for me. And I even said this, if they say that they're using it to do this, then ask them to explain how that technology works. And what are you doing with my data? And I know for a fact, platforms like a Turnitin, it started off, they used technical journals and they used Wikipedia as their source data. But they didn't stay there. Every time a paper gets loaded in, guess what? That now becomes part of their source data without your knowledge, without your consent, and ultimately it's taking of your intellectual property to be used in a platform that is monetized. And we can even get into the whole idea around how many false positives it comes up. And I've seen a bunch of different numbers, but usually it says that it's only it's reliable about 20% of the time. And my whole thing is, are we okay with a 20% success rate when it comes to things like this? And if you'll notice, I have these other questions, and I shared this with him, and I share it with other folks that I know have children in university. Can you provide details on how the material is being used and protected? If you can't answer these questions, why are you using it? Why didn't you ask these questions before you engaged in that contract? Can you explain exactly how the platform works? Can the teacher or professor? What safeguards are in place when, not if, it yields a false positive? And I'm going to point to another thing in a moment. Are the platforms using to reinforce, and here's the real thing, are you using the platforms to reinforce power dynamics and compliance or to ensure, quote unquote, academic integrity? That's what's really going on. Remember a remix? I mentioned that? That's what it is. A remix of the power dynamics. Here's something that is in the power of you, the consumer, and I need to reorient that power dynamic so I still have dominion over you, your learning, and ultimately what is a big factor they use? Your grade. And so my friend whose brother had to deal with this, I sent him a screenshot of this slide here. I said, share that with your brother. Brother went into, because his brother was accused of academic fraud and academic dishonesty, and he was immediately put on academic probation without a hearing and without consideration. And I said, don't even waste your time fighting with that. Look at these questions, and the first thing I would do when I go in, I say, produce that piece of paper that I signed that gave you consent to put my work into that program. I said, there's your argument right there. Just don't even get into the details. I would start off with that. And that's what he did. And I said, now I would share with them the other question, because ultimately the dean rescinded it, and they were like, okay, you're right, we shouldn't have done this. And I sent him a screenshot of the OpenAI guidelines, and I said, you should send that to him as well. It literally tells you don't do this. And so my point in sharing this with all of you before I get into, we go into some more activities here, is this is why the conversation has to occur on a larger scale. We cannot allow the conversation about artificial intelligence to be oversimplified and limited to, here's 10 ways to use it, here's 100 different ways to use it, because all of these things are happening to real people in real time. And this is dialogue that must occur in education, because this is what I say is this is how technology and a lack of understanding of how it works is often weaponized to reinforce power dynamics. Now, here's the next thing. One of these two images is AI image generated. I'm going to pause and let you all take a look. All right, here we go. How many of you guess it's the image on the left? Maybe a third of you. And then on the right? And then how many of you don't want to vote? Okay. Okay, so here's the truth. The image on the left is the real image. And how do I know that? Because that's my picture. What you're looking at is one of my favorite castles in Germany called Burg Eltz. It is literally about an hour's drive west-southwest of Frankfurt, Germany. And the image on the right, I used a couple of different image generators, and I did a bunch of different prompts and changing and refining until I could get it as close to realistic as possible. And the whole idea around this is not so much whether I use an image generator or not. It goes to the whole idea around going to the ethical side. How would you feel if I used the one on the right and represented it as my own, or I use it in a capacity and didn't share with you? I use an image generator for this. That is a subjective thing to analyze. Take a look at these videos. How many of you think the image with the cliff is AI generated? How many of you think the image with the dogs is AI generated? All right, you ready? How many of you think both are AI generated? There we go. Yeah, they both are. See that? That goes back to what I shared around one, should we provide transparency on whether we use AI to generate media? And you see those videos, they are pretty darn good. And that's right now. My whole thing is, when I hear a student saying, yeah, I'm going to use the video generator, I always go to, I hear you on that, but I also have a question. Do you understand the fundamental concepts of visual storytelling? Y'all see what I did there, right? I'm okay with you using that, but you got to, going back to sacrificing long-term benefits for short-term, if you understand the fundamental concepts of visual storytelling, and then you don't have the ability to go with a camera and fly a helicopter to capture a peninsula, you don't own dogs, or like me living in LA, you don't live in a place where there's going to be snow on the ground, I actually don't have a problem with you using that. But do you understand the fundamentals of visual storytelling? And this is where I get into the whole philosophical argument around whether or not it's real art. I'm not worried about whether it's real art or not, because art is subjective. What I am concerned about, and what's more important to me, is does it dismantle barriers to creativity for our learners? And based upon that answer of being yes, do they understand in this context the fundamentals of visual storytelling? Because that will be the basis for the type of prompts that they put together and the type of video they put together. You all see, I'm not going to get into the end. I want to know what the foundational beginning is. Let's talk about fact and bias. We just did in the social experiment where I had you all fill in the blank. The original data sets of these large language models were primarily Wikipedia, YouTube, social media. But they cast a bigger net. Blog posts, additional, more social media posts, and then a little bit bigger net. How many of you in this room have heard of 4chan? For those of you that haven't, you may not have heard of it, but I guarantee you've heard a phrase of what it is, and that's called the dark web. So that big net is capturing all of that. It's going to get all the good. It's also going to get some of the bad. And this is why we have to understand the data sets and the coding. So I want to show you all a couple of things that are harmful. So number one, when it comes to the image generators, except for one, and I will point that one out, the primary data set that they used was Google Images to start. Here's an example of what it looks like with bias in the algorithms and the design. So, and yes, I already did the search, and someone used to say, well, you know, your search history. I'm like, feel free to do the search yourself, and you'll see. I did an image search. If you'll notice my search here, professional hairstyles. Take a look at the pictures. Okay? I did another search. Unprofessional hairstyles. Take a look at the images. That's what an example of bias in the data sets and bias in the algorithm looks like. And yes, you would say, well, Ken, that's Google image search, not the image generators. Where do you think the image generators are getting their data sets from? Primarily. You're looking at it. Also, I want you all to see this one. I went into ChatGPT, I just did this morning, and I said, you are a screenwriter and a playwright. Generate a one-scene dialogue between a nurse and a doctor about a patient being assessed for cardiac arrest. Some of you are smiling because you already know. Look at the names of the doctor and the name of the nurse. That is another example of bias in the data sets. Y'all see it, right? Okay? The whole idea, you all asked for scenario 2. I'm giving you the whole picture, not just a part of the picture. And this goes to the whole idea around a couple of other things that I'm going to show you in the time we have left. I do want to show you all, if we know that that exists, then what are the practices, again, acute language skills, what are the things we can do to reduce the likelihood of that occurrence? Before I get into that, I also want to share with you all the gatekeepers. These are questions that you all should be asking of every single AI platform that is developed, and especially if it is packaged and promoted to education. And sadly, when I do ask many of the developers, I do not get answers to these questions, which is a major red flag for me. What are the data sets that they're using? Most of them, their original source data is the API from OpenAI, most of them, which means they're getting all that good, but they're also getting the bad, okay? Is that data labeled? Is it supervised? What does labeled data look like and supervised data? Anytime you go into those customer chatbots, that's data that has been both labeled and supervised. Good response, bad response. Good example, bad example. It's labeled and it's supervised. What does it look like for it to be labeled but somewhat supervised? You ever notice if you use Netflix or something like Spotify, based on your viewing or listening pattern, it makes recommendations. That is data that is labeled and semi-supervised. It provides some sort of signpost. But you also have to ask question number 2, diversity of the design and decision-making team. What are their perspective and experiences in alignment with those of the student? What are their lived experiences? What is the intended impact on education? Again, is it going to support and support rethinking, or is it supporting simply a remix? Those are questions to always be asking around that. In addition to that, some other things to keep in mind are these. Because AI can't answer some of these questions. How well do I even know my students in the first place? How do they define ethics in my classroom? If they're using AI, how are they using it? Are there any good ways? How do I know? What role do I play in supporting my students? If I were in a classroom right now, I literally would say, we're going to do it, and we're going to use it, and I want you all to point out, if you did a prompt that you felt was really effective, we're going to create a curation of prompts for the project we're working on or something like that, and I want you to put it in there. And then those of you that are not getting what you want, try one that one of your classmates made, and then make a modification. Then we curate this whole idea around how to use it. By the way, that's also modeling what I would say responsible use of it. So what I want to do in the time I have left is kind of take a look at a few things around this. So when it comes to our image generator, first of all, we don't have time to get into it, but those are the 5 core essentials of visual storytelling. Remember I mentioned, I'm not worried about a student going and using a video generator. I'm going to ask him, do you understand these 5 things first? Because if you understand these 5 things, that means that you now have a basis for what language you use for your prompt. So, with that being said, with the image generators, you have to do it in this capacity. Your prompt always has to include, and this is for image generators to start, it must include context, setting, details, any additional information. It must be clear, concise, and unambiguous. Here's what happens when you do one that is concise but ambiguous. This is a screenshot. I did an image search and I typed in flight attendant. That was it. I just typed in flight attendant, and that was the result. I was clear, I was concise, but I was ambiguous. I did not provide setting, context, and details, okay? Then I did lawyer, same search, just lawyer. These are the bias in the data sets. And again, what's the flaw? If I know the bias is there, the flaw was me making these queries clear, concise, but ambiguous. I want you all to do a quick experiment here. I used an image generator to make that, and I'm going to run out of time here, I think. I'll go over a couple. Anyway, but what I want you all to do, as you look at this image, I want you to even dialogue with the person next to you. What do you think was my prompt to generate this image? What syntax did I use? Remember, context, setting, details, additional information. About 15 more seconds. All right, so remember I mentioned prompt for image generators. Context setting, details, additional information, clear, concise, and unambiguous. All right, here was a prompt that I used for this, and I will share with you all I used Adobe Firefly, and I will share with you all why I use Adobe Firefly and why that is my first image generator to go to, okay? So here was a prompt that I used. A beach chair with an open umbrella on a beach with waves crashing at sunset. The sky has some clouds. There is a slight wind blowing, and the sun is just above the horizon. That was my whole prompt. Context, setting, details, additional information. Clear, concise, unambiguous. Now tell me, even something like what you all just did, tell me how that doesn't neatly fit into a comprehensive approach to literacy and digital literacy at that. Y'all see, what you all did was reverse engineer that. You all engaged in all of these things here just by way of doing what you just did. Now, I'll share with you all my main reason why I like to use Adobe Firefly goes back to these questions here, and especially number one. I'm not knocking the other image generators, but Adobe Firefly, I know the following. Their data sets are from Adobe stock, which means we can't just put any image into Adobe stock. There's a vetting process for that, which tells me that there at least are some guardrails on what's in the source data. Yes, it will limit what your outputs can be, but that's why I go to that as a start. Because I know what data sets they use. I know that that source data, initially the source data, has been labeled and supervised, okay? And this is also why we should always ask of these platforms, if you're using it in education, does your platform provide elements of data cleansing? That's what the term is called. That means that there's ways to remove a lot of the bad stuff, okay? But continuing on, we don't have time, but this is a fun one to try to recreate. And again, think about what you all just did with the image I did. I love having people go through the activity of trying to recreate this. Context, setting, details, additional information. And as you would do that, what you're doing in your brain is you are going in alignment with a lot of those visual storytelling essentials. So I'm going to be at time, but I want to just share a couple of things. And I'll add these to this SCED for you all. So these are questions to consider when it comes to the image generators. What barriers of visual storytelling currently exist for our learners? How might an image generator or AI image platform dismantle those barriers, especially to creativity? What strategies we need to develop to be effective at this? And then how do those things fit into that? Let me do a last couple of things. So when it comes to the large language models, here are your guidelines for prompt engineering. You must provide a specific purpose, specific parameters, a perspective, and then the practice part is just changing some of the terminology. So I'll give you all a simple example of one. How many of you have used one of the large language models to generate a list? How many of you said, give me a list, okay? Here's the catch with this and how it's different with the practice. There is a major difference between, I would say, give me a list of 10 items around blank versus provide me an unabridged and comprehensive list of items on blank. And here's the key that I always say to do this. Always, always, always force it to do its reasoning. Provide a justification for each item in that list. So for example, if I taught science, I would say, give me an unabridged list of 10 different hooks I can provide to students in the context of learning physics, make it accessible to a 10th grader, make it culturally appropriate, and provide a rationale or justification as to why you included this on the list. You all see what I'm doing there? I don't want just a list. I want to force the large language model to tell me why this is on there. That is another way with large language models to address the bias part. And even ask it, is this a biased list? Does it confirm something that is already in your data sets? I'll just go my last couple of things. The whole idea around that, the whole idea around being clear and concise and unambiguous is to understand that our large language models work based on this, which is called word vectoring. Think about, as you look at this, what type of result am I going to get if I just say location versus I specifically say Los Angeles? And the whole idea is to recognize that. Last couple of things. The whole idea is to recognize how to modify our prompts. Instead of asking it to give me a list, I want an unabridged, a whole list, or all items in the list, or a full-length list, and justify why each item is in the list. Clint, I'm going to finish up in 30 seconds. And I could get into more, but ultimately, again, the whole idea, oh no, we can't do this one. But the main point around this is that as you all look at artificial intelligence and what it can do in regards to transforming our learning experiences, what I really want you all to look at is how do we bridge the gap between the promise and then the reality? What are the ways in which we can develop these skill sets that are evergreen and transform how we use it, not allow a platform to automate and microwave our learning? Again, going back to that ethical question, am I sacrificing long-term benefits for short-term gains? And that's why my plug here is this is actually the cover art of a book that I'm co-authoring with my BFF Dee Lanier, and that's our working title right now, is The Promises and Perils of AI in Education. Scenario 2, the whole picture. How do we look at the promise and leverage that, and how do we identify and acknowledge the perils and mitigate those from the effects of those? And so then these are some of your thinking prompts going forward. How do we address the things about AI and its impact on education we are unsure of? What are the things we are opposed to and should not be? What questions should we have to those that are in favor of AI but not providing a full picture? And then the last one is how might we leverage technology to dismantle patterns and predictability of learning experiences and outcomes? And that's the whole idea around transformation. If it's predictable, then that means it's also preventable. So I apologize for going over time. I will definitely stick around for anybody who has any specific questions of me. I do hope that you all continue to learn and grow within the context of our generative AI. Practice, 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 play, play, play. Acknowledge and recognize that there are biases in our data sets, but those biases should not serve as a barrier towards our usage. They should serve as a signpost that if I know it exists, then what are the strategies I can do to circumvent that from ending up in the results or impacting the results. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you.